thank you. Welcome to the last panel session of this year's OTT conference. We have been talking about the relationship between think tanks and different actors in the policy research ecosystem, and it is a turn of the private sector. And we have with us Chris Richards from ICE in the UK, that is the Institute of Civil Engineers. We have Asundi from CSTEP in India. We have Bitrina Diyamett from Stipro in Tanzania, and we have Laure Toll from IPAR. She's Director of Research, and Laure is going to help me to reflect on and discuss with our panelists. And we've asked them to get this conversation started by sharing with us some examples, some experiences, some reflections on the relationship between think tanks and the private sector in their own countries, in their own sectors. And to try to help us address at least three questions. Why are these collaborations important? What results can come out of them? What looks like a good collaboration, and what lessons can we learn from them to make them stronger, to make them more effective in the future? And why don't we start with Chris? Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about the experience of the Institute of Civil Engineers in working with the private sector?
Cool. Yeah, no, more than happy to. Thanks, Enrique, and thanks to On Think Tanks for the invitation as well. So IC's work in the policy space is similar to that of the Policy Institute. It's best to think of us as a sort of Centre for Sustainability through Infrastructure. And we're a 200-year-old institution founded by a group of civil engineers who wanted to share best practice and knowledge about how to build sustainably, and that ethos is carried on to this day. And I'll come on to give some examples around that. But just to set the scene, for those of you who are new to infrastructure policy, not thought about it, infrastructure policy design, planning and delivery is complex, takes a long time, and it cuts across political cycles. You kind of think of those big mega projects around the world. You're looking for politicians to kind of, from different political parties and even within the same political parties, to share the same ambition around infrastructure. And typically what we see is governments don't plan ahead, and then there's a shortage of supply, and they panic, and they come up with poorly designed or scoped projects which limit time for discussion, complex considerations like climate change, climate resilience, the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's where we kind of come in to try and our research agenda is focused on learning lessons from live projects and programs to plug back into discussions on new and emerging infrastructure priorities, so that we can speed up that lesson learning rather than waiting for the end of one project, which could be 10 years to complete. We're learning lessons a lot faster. And we particularly find that considerations of things like sustainability is often in the too difficult pile, given everything else that needs to be decided. So focus is on how to expand that space to allow those discussions to take place. So that's where partnerships come in, and partnerships with the private sector. If we use the term loosely, partnerships with the private sector and policy sits within this space. And they're a good source of evidence of what's working and what isn't when it comes to doing infrastructure better. They're the ones who are doing the delivery of projects, and so they have a better understanding of if we need to consider, say, a new net zero target for infrastructure. How does that relate to a project that's already live, already being constructed? How do you start to embed net zero climate change principles in projects that are already being designed? So that's where we find the private sector particularly helps, is understanding what's going on now and what's working. They also provide insight on what would need to change for sustainability considerations, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, climate action and resilience, to be properly considered in infrastructure design, planning and delivery. As realistically, they're the ones doing the delivery, so they have a good understanding of how you can take some of those big ticket considerations and put it into practice. And just two other things I wanted to highlight as well in terms of the partnerships we find work well with the private sector. So in some areas, change is best achieved through the private sector, particularly kind of construction firms, infrastructure firms are heavily staffed by civil engineers, and that ethos I talked about around making the world a better place is embedded within those firms. And sometimes we find actually those private sector firms use what leverage they have to push boundaries until they bump up against regulatory or other barriers, and that's where we can start to learn lessons from them as well about, if you do want to go further and faster on things like social value considerations from infrastructure, you kind of have to have a conversation with them about what's actually happening. And separately, there's often a kind of symbiotic relationship as well, where the private sector may benefit from some of the campaigns we run, even if they aren't the main, that the main aim isn't directed at private sector benefits. So I'll give the example of our Enabling Better Infrastructure initiative, which is aiming to ensure countries around the world have a long-term, evidence-based and SDG-aligned national infrastructure strategies so that they can choose the right projects in the right sequence for public benefit. Now, if you have a long-term strategy, obviously the private sector benefits because they have a clear forward pipeline of potential projects that they could bid for, so they can start to secure the right skills and capabilities to be more successful in win those bids. So that's one example where you have this kind of symbiotic relationship where the private sector benefits even though they're not the main aim of the campaign we're running. So it's an interesting space and one that relies a lot on trust and understanding of organizational objectives. I mean, I'd say we've been around for a very long time. We've built that relationship with these organizations for a while, and they understand where we're coming from. This is about public benefit more than anything else, and just by starting off on that basis, you then have a much more trust-based conversation because they're not starting off from a public benefit point of view. They've got commercial considerations, and you just try and find a way of working together where those two Venn diagrams sort of overlap. So yeah, I'll pause there, Enrique, and looking forward to the conversation.
Very much, Chris. That was very rich and very enlightening as well. I think it's going to connect well with our other panelists. Let me go to Jay. At CSTEP in India, you've also had experience working in partnership, in collaboration with the private sector. Tell us about that experience, and maybe in what ways it's similar or different to what we've just heard from Chris in the UK.
Yeah, thanks Enrique, and thanks to the On Think Tanks team for inviting me for this session. I think a lot of the things that Chris said do reflect what I will want to say. But what I would probably start with is two very specific examples. So then we can step back from that and take, I would say, the similar lessons. We as a think tank working in science and technology we worked on a very interesting project quite a few years ago in what was called the Perform, Achieve and Trade scheme of the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. And this was the point about how do we enhance energy efficiency in our industries. And at that time, what was the first cycle was the designated consumers of energy. As all of us now know, is that the best way to reduce energy emissions is by not making those emissions, and energy efficiency is supposed to be the best way to do that. And one of the things that was being done was to essentially identify specific energy consumption through a market-based approach. The idea was to create a market where you have entities that are very good at energy efficiency to be incentivized to do more of it, and then trade those additional certificates with entities that are not able to do that. And that was the basic structure to that. Of course, there is a problem here, is that the idea is that there are certain industries like cement, iron and steel, depending on where they're located, the kinds of specific energy consumption will be different because of their locations. Now, you do not want to create a situation where an entity is being penalized for being in a particular location. So there had to be some adjustments for that. And so what we did out there was actually be the intermediary between industry and the government, because the industry wanted to know that the government was not imposing a system on them that was too onerous. At the same time, the government wanted to know that the industry was not taking the law for a ride and setting very easy targets, because then there would be no market. So the good thing that we ended up doing was doing a very good benchmarking study across all these what we call 8 sectors, and we came up with benchmarks for specific energy consumption, which was accepted by both sides. So there was a lot of back and forth that went on, and finally they came to an agreement, and that was how it was done. And the test of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. And as you know, the overall savings ended up being about 6.686 million tons of oil equivalent by 2015 and went to almost 8.6 million tons of oil equivalent. So that's equivalent to about a 30% overachievement over and above if there was just a standard that was set, right? Which is amazing. So that came out to about 31 million tons of CO2 saving in that period of time. So I would say a fairly successful program. So that was one way in which we engaged with the private sector. So it was more working with the industry entities, but at arm's length on both sides. The second example is more on a detailed engagement with private industry. And this was to do with developing a pilot on how rooftop solar photovoltaic cells can be used to charge electric vehicles. And that was a very pilot project that was done at a government installation. And the idea was that we had designed a system, and the idea is how would we use renewable energy to charge electric to mobility, because as you know, in India, oil is all imported and it was considered to be very good for energy security. And here the idea of the engagement with the private sector was to ensure that we can expand the options available to society when we are looking at the entire question of green transition. How are we going to do that? And in this case, there are two aspects that need to be covered. One is the industry seeing whether this is even a viable option, so working with them on a pilot. On the second hand, it's also to give government the idea that this is something that is viable and needs to be regulated in a particular manner. Because if the industry had gone to the government directly, there would be a possibility that they might say that this is too early, not something that they would want to take risk on, and things like that. And I think with the pilot, it kind of brought both parties together and be able to think about a future going forward much quicker than we would have otherwise expected. So these are, I guess, two good examples of how think tanks can engage with private industry, at the same time maintaining their independence and their engagement with the policymakers, because that's where our primary focus is. But it doesn't mean that industry is pariah. We still have to work with them, because if we want to scale any idea, it will have to be done with industry. So I'll stop there, Enrique, and take further questions as we go forward.
Yes, thank you very much. That was those two examples very illustrative of this conversation and different roles that a think tank can play in its engagement with the private sector. Let me go to Bitrina now in Tanzania and ask her about their experience with work with the private sector and in different relationships. And let me add something which I commented before in a private meeting we had, but it's out of coincidence that the three think tanks here today work in the field of science, technology, engineering, that maybe biases the relationship with the private sector, but offer us lots of examples and lots of opportunities to learn. Bitrina, can you tell us a little bit about Stipro's experience in its engagement with the private sector?
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to this event. Actually responding to the question you have just raised, Enrique, is that I think I don't think if it is a coincidence. I think the three think tanks, the three organizations, I think they work a lot with the private sector. I think that is the reason. I mean, every organization that works on science and technology to a large extent, the private sector will be a good part of their actors or respondent for research. So I think that is the reason. Our experience, and I'm afraid, I think, the context matters. I have been listening to my colleagues and I was asking myself, I don't think if they have got issues with access to resources as think tanks, as organization, I would love to ask questions. Where did the kind of resources, where did they get from? I mean, the kind of things they have been doing, who provided funding for that? I mean, for us, we don't have that luxury of actually getting funding. And plus, the private sector in our countries, in poor countries like in Tanzania, is very much underdeveloped. So these are completely different contexts, you know, from the two speakers. And maybe just to say that why would a think tank, which is a public organization working for the public, why would they collaborate with the private sector? These are economic agents seeking for profit. You know, we have to to justify the legitimacy for that. And I think this is clear. I mean, the private sector is very important for development. We say that they are engine of growth. So for us, for instance, in Tanzania, we have two major reasons, you know, to kind of engage with the private sector generally, is that we want to provide evidence so that government can have policy. And I think we have interest in that. It has to be developed. And second, it has to be developed in such a way, you see, they can make profit, they can be competitive, that we have interest, but in a way that is useful to the society. And I think in this way, I kind of, you know, talk to my colleagues, especially Chris, specifically to Stipro. Yeah, we are collaborating the private sector. As I said, that they are major actors in our research activities, and we have two major incentives actually to collaborate. First is they assist us in getting information about the private sector. We want to know. I mean, they sit on our board so that we know every time what is happening with the private sector, but they also help us with our research activities. They provide respondents, you know, samples, they help us with that, but they also help us to disseminate the information, because when we meet, we organize events such as roundtables, research dissemination workshops, we always invite the private sector, and they always come, and they come also, they know that they are meeting other actors, especially the government. If our piece of research is actually, it's important for them, they will come. And they will add to our statistics. You know, when we have provided a statistic about 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3 has to be done, the private sector who are present there add the voice, and the government, the policymaker is sitting there. It actually forces the government somehow, and it has happened to a number of projects that have carried out, to actually implement. And this is it's mutual. I think Chris also mentioned this. I don't know whether it's Chris or Jai, that this is mutual. The private sector also wants us always. They always invite us to their meetings. They make use of us, especially, you know, government in Tanzania, when they make any policy, the practice is that they will always send the policy to stakeholders for comments. So the private sector will always invite us to comment on the policy, because we have got statistics, we have got expertise, so they value that. So it's a mutual kind of benefit. The second thing that makes us to give incentive to collaborate with the private sector is access to funding. My colleagues have not talked about this. I think funding is not a problem to them, but for us it is a problem. And you know, for poor countries such as Tanzania, producing knowledge, local resources is extremely important. Otherwise, we'll be producing knowledge for other people. So and where is the local resource come from? They come from the private sector. So we engage our private sector to see kind of things that we are doing, the impact of what we are doing to them, so that they can provide funding, so that we can have our own resources, local resources, and for to kind of work on our own priorities. And talking to about the second thing is about challenges. You know, the challenges, I don't know whether I can mention a lot of things, but I've told you that, you know, even the collaboration between the private sector and the think tanks in poor countries such as Tanzania, it's not so much. You know, it's at a very low level. So experiencing challenges and what is not that much. But one thing that I can say about challenges that, you know, the private sector, much as they are not very much, they don't have resources for research. And most of their resources, they get it because we collaborate with the Apex organization, their associations. They get money from the donors also. It's not their money. It's not money from the private sector of Tanzania. So that is a challenge, because if that money is given to them and it's not allocated to research, how can they give money to research in Tanzania? So they cannot. But they have small resources. I think they collect from the local private sector. That kind of resources is not really good for the thinkers, because it is focused on very specific issue based that is used for lobbying, which is not good. I mean, for the credibility, we avoid to do that. We avoid to take that money. So I think this all that I can say. I can answer questions if there are questions around that.
But I think you've raised thank you, Bitrina. Sorry, I interrupt you, but I think you've raised a very important point. And so let me go back to Chris and Jay before I go to Lo for some reflections, some comments. Exactly, context matters, right? And different countries, different private sector ecosystems, I guess, are at different levels of engagement with research and with research organizations. Can you tell us a little bit about a question Bitrina had, in terms of in your relationship with the private sector, what role does the private sector vis-a-vis other actors play in funding that work and allowing you to develop that? Because of course it's much harder to manage independence if the funder is the private sector that is participating in the project, than if the funding comes from another source. And that in itself brings its own challenges. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Maybe you can start with Chris and then Jay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Enrique, and thanks for the comments there. I mean, I guess I see we're quite fortunate in that I'm attached effectively to a civil engineering kind of chartered professional institute. So most of our funding comes from that source. So we don't have to kind of rely on going externally. So context does matter in that sense.
Exactly.
And I fully appreciate that. That gives the flexibility to engage with the private sector in a way where you don't have to ask for funds. So that does help. But it's worth saying as well. I mean, we do get approached all the time by organizations who want to give us funding. So that they could, attach their logo to a report or something like that, and you do have to kind of manage that and say, actually, let's push back on that. That's not necessarily where we want to go, but where we do feel comfortable is the kind of in-kind support. So, can we borrow borrow a room to host a launch event or a roundtable? Could we potentially this happened a long time ago. It doesn't happen often, but could you second someone into our organization just to help us with a bit of data or something along those lines? So those are the kind of areas where we're comfortable with private sector input, where it's in-kind support rather than cash, because I think it just makes us feel more comfortable that way. And it's worth saying about some of these organizations that we work with do their own research. We're talking about global firms here that do their own research. And I think what's interesting is, even though they do their own stuff, they recognize that that's always going to be seen through the lens of, well, you're only writing this because it will give you some kind of commercial gain. And so they're aware of that, even though they still publish it anyway, but they're completely aware of the fact that that research is always going to be tainted by that impression that this is a commercial gain. And I think that's where we can play as an organization, that kind of intermediary role of, to some extent, scrutinizing what's out there and saying, what's going to work, what's not going to work, what's working in practice on the ground. And I think that's the role that we sometimes play as that kind of like triage for all these organizations who have competing interests. So completely appreciate that it's a context matters type situation, and we're fortunate in that we can push back and say no to funding. But where we do feel comfortable is that in-kind support, and that's perhaps an area where other think tanks can look as well about if you don't want to be accused of kind of taking cash for a report, could you look at breaking down the different components of putting together a research program and get in-kind support for different aspects of it as a way of balancing that risk?
Great, thank you, Chris. Jay, do you want to reflect on that as well? Tell us a little bit how the relationship works vis-a-vis funding.
So I think my first two examples were actually, now reflecting on them, were examples of partnerships. It was not so much about the funding relationship between them and us. In fact, those are the projects where we did not take any money from the private sector. It was actually working with them with funding from an external source where we worked on that particular, but then we still had to get the data from the private entities. Or in the second case of Rooftop, we actually worked with a private entity to get them to install. So we actually did not take any resources from them. And that is something that we have been very clear about, is that if there is any whiff of conflict of interest, and this has happened in the past where we're working on certain policies and certain entities come to us wanting particular reports, which we could do very easily given the knowledge base that we have. We step away from that and say that you can ask a consulting entity to do that for you by using our reports, which has actually happened. They've used our public reports and produced something for the private entity, and we've not taken any money from them because we are involved in some policy making position, and so we stay away from any engagement where there could be a conflict of interest. So this brings us to the part where what is the engagement that we could work on is through the industry associations, where let's say we are working with an entire body of entities, so there's no single entity that's involved. It could be like in India, we have a number of industry bodies, like we've got the National for Software Service Companies called NASSCOM. That is it's an industry body. There's something called FICCI that we are a member of, the Federation of Industry Commerce Industries. Again, these are bodies that we can engage with and work with them to produce the kind of outputs that we would want to put in. So I think, yes, there is a when it comes to financial engagements, then we have to be a little careful in terms of what type of engagement we are doing with the private sector. Now, as far as India is concerned, think tanks can do consulting for private industry, but it is only up to 20% of their overall revenues. So there's already a limitation there. So that's number one. There are funds called the corporate social responsibility funds, which are really rooted through the foundations of companies. Again, that we've found to be something that private industry is more interested in specific areas that they work in or specific ideas that they have. And again, that to us is too close for comfort in terms of conflict of interest. So we stay away from those kinds of engagements. The goal or what we are trying to work on has to be driven by us. It's not to be driven by an external entity. It's what we are driving rather than what the entity or the private entity is driving. So that is where they could come up with an idea, but then at the same time, we have to look at it as, say, does this serve a particular public policy perspective? And the fact that the work that will be independent, and that is important. So far we haven't really gotten into any of those types of engagements where there will be a conflict of interest. But for us, it's an issue of clarifying certain issues to government and to private industry. And if both of them find that new information, if gathered, put together in the right form, can move things forward, either through sustainability or through development, then it's a win-win situation. And that's where our role is. But it's not in places where there's an adversarial aspect related to that.
Yeah, it makes me think as well that there's a need to sort of build a new generation of the private sector that will appreciate research, appreciate think tanks, and be interested in either supporting them through associations and or engaging with them in different ways. And that might be one of the roles that foreign international development funders could play in certain contexts, where not just giving money to civil society, but also to those other actors that have to step in later on to fund the work of civil society and others at the country level. Laura, why don't you let me give you now the the space to reflect from what you've heard, and if you have any questions to Chris, Jay, and Bitrina, but also reflect from the experience that IPAR has with the private sector in Senegal. And as I understand, IPAR works very closely with farmer associations to some extent. That is the private sector.
Thank you, Enrique. It was quite interesting because for us in Senegal, farmers are not private sector. Farmers are civil society. So it's kind of a really strange thing. And when we talk about private sector in agriculture, most of the time they are the bad guys. But let's start by saying that all private sector are not created equal. I am listening to the three panelists, and I am thinking, do we have this type of private sector in my context? And I'm not sure that this is the case. When I am thinking of private sector in Senegal, for example, it's mainly very, very small company with no research and development department, no strategy department, and then it is difficult to engage with them and try to offer counseling, analysis when they don't have the basics. So it's interesting, and even if they are interested in the research, they do not have budgets to fund this research. In the other hand, you have donors and also governments in these developing countries that are really aware that the private sector is key to the economical growth of their countries, and they are willing to fund this private sector, and they are willing to fund any organization that can help strengthen private sector. So how can think tank can take advantage of this situation where we have a private sector that is still struggling and do not have enough resources to have this research, and take advantage of these donors that are willing to give money to anybody that can strengthen the private sector. So how can we manage this to be the link between both, and how do we present ourselves to target this type of funds? Over.
Thank you. Thank you, Laure. Let me ask Chris, Jay, and Bitrina first to respond. But something that comes to mind is that Chris said is that some of the projects you work on and some of the proposals you work on are about giving stability, right? It's about changing the framework in which the private sector operates, such as these long-term plans. And to some extent, that's building capacity, or that's building capabilities, strengthening the private sector, right? It's not necessarily giving them skills, like management skills, but it's giving them the context in which the private sector can thrive. And I think funders sometimes don't see it that way, right? They don't see that, kind of making contributions to a more stable, evidence-based policy framework is actually a way of strengthening the private sector, civil society, and others. And that's a role think tanks play all the time. That's something they're trying to do. Let me let Chris, Jay, and Bitrina respond to Laure or reflect on something else you'd like to do. And maybe I'll start with Chris, and then I'll let others who want to join from the audience to tell us a little bit about their own stories and their own context.
Cool. Thanks, Enrique, and thanks, Laure. Yeah, just picking up on that point around, everyone benefits from more stable decision making, and I think that's where we've worked the most effectively with the private sector. It's where we're doing that, where they can see the value that they will get from that stability around decision making. And yeah, to the point that Enrique said, we shouldn't forget that the private sector employs people. The private sector delivers a lot of services, and that's the point I was trying to reinforce in my intro, which is often they can be the sources of change where you don't need to then talk about policy change. You can talk about what the private sector is doing and encourage more of it happening. And I think that's quite an interesting space that a lot of think tanks don't look at, where often you don't need governments to step in if it's more just about amplifying or shining a light on the positives you're seeing in the private sector that you want more people or more firms to do. So yeah, so I'd probably just leave it there as kind of areas to reinforce that, you know, the private sector has a potential to lead some of the social change that we've been talking about, and there's a good role here for think tanks to play that kind of chaperoning role to get them to change themselves.
Great. And that's about think tanks thinking beyond policy, as you know, policy and public policymakers as their audience and their objective, right? It could be about changing the behaviors, the practices of the private sector, just as it could be about changing behaviors and practices of civil society in general, and other actors in society, right? Not just only policymakers.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is in itself, what you're saying, it's in itself a very limited understanding, a limited view of what policy is, because it assumes that it can only be done by bureaucrats or politicians, when in fact it involves, you know, many other actors through its design and implementation. So that's an interesting view. Jay, any reflections on that on law?
You know, I think Chris said it very well, is that the stable environment. But I think we need to also keep in mind what Laura is talking about, is that the industry is not as developed. I think Chris and I are coming from places where industry is far more developed, far more defined. I mean, the very fact that she talks about entities that do not have a strategy department or do not have R&D in their own facilities. I mean, the places that we are, typically we have firms coming to us after they've done the R&D. They don't come to us before the R&D. So in some ways, they have already decided, or they have come to a conclusion that this is the way the policy should be moving, right? And I think in some senses, they are also looking for, I don't know whether to call it external validation, but some other entity, an independent voice to come in and say, yes, this is indeed a good policy. And I think that is something that we have to be also careful of as an entity, that are we being driven down a road because it looks good? And you know, so I think that's it. So I think the one thing that I would want to say is that the way a think tank could maneuver that is to, one is examine the public policy question there and try to figure out where there's a win-win situation, right? Because I don't think industry is always, or private industry, private enterprise is bad, because they are employing people. After all, at the end of the day, they provide employment. But at the same time, I think you have to make sure that they do not become monopolistic, or, you know, all the bad practices of private industry that we talk about. So how do you get the government also to get the kind of evidence that they need, so that, especially in issues where there's regulation, right? Either it's in clean air, clean water, any of these issues that do come up, and I think figuring out that and showing the private industry how a good policy would benefit them in the long run, and to show government how good industry would benefit them in the long run. And this is something that we are currently very active on right now, especially as we look at green transition in India. How do we get rooftop systems installed on our roofs? This is a very fertile area for us, because there is the government on one side, there's the private industry on one side, and no one is absolutely right. And I think figuring that out and figuring out that middle ground and figuring out solutions to take it forward is where the real challenge is. And I think we all will agree that there is no fun if there's no challenge. And I think that's where I would stop.
Thank you, Jay. There's no fun if there's no challenge. It's true. Bitrina, any reflections, any responses to Laura's comment on or what Chris and Jay said?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I actually agree with Laura about the smallness of the private sector, because it is the same context, that's the African context. For us, the major focus, rather than perhaps behavior of the private sector addressing the issues around the behavior, I think that is one. But I think the major focus is also how can we make our private sector productive? How can we make our private sector competitive? Innovation and technology, how can they, what should be government policies? That is really a major concern for us with a weak private sector. For us, it is that. Of course, also trying to influence that they should not misbehave, you know. But the major focus is how can we grow our private sector, because it's so important. We are saying that is key. I think we all agree. And we have to have a thriving private sector if we will talk about poverty alleviation, all sorts of things that we are talking about. And I want to say something about R&D research. I think R&D and the kind of research we are doing are things that those are slightly different. R&D and policy research. R&D is basically producing, you know, products, you know, tangible products, and but policy research is influences this kind of R&D, because without policy research, you cannot even get your R&D right. So we have to engage with the private sector and the government to make sure that they carry out, if at all they carry out, because they don't carry out in Africa, most of them. In case for those who carry out the right kind of R&D. So that this is the relationship between policy research, the kind of research us as think tanks are doing, and the R&D with the private sector. And another issue that was raised by Laura about the donors being ready to fund, you know, activities, you know, promotion of the private sector. Yes, I think they do. But what I know, because this is my own experience, I have been looking for money for these 4 years to produce knowledge that helps the African private sector to be competitive and innovative. I think we don't have that knowledge from donors. It's very few donors provide such knowledge. And this is the reason I'm saying, unless our private sector basically fund knowledge generation, we will really go nowhere, because there's very little coming from the donors to produce knowledge for policy, to make sure your private sector become competitive and it becomes innovative. We don't have that kind of resources. Few donors do, but there isn't. It has to come from us. And Jai, you talked about, I think you said that you do not directly ask for money from the private sector, but I think indirectly you do. For instance, if you are taking money from a philanthropic organization that is being funded by the private sector, that money which is not allocated to anything, perhaps is core, then it is a money from the private sector. And I think this is a kind of environment that we are talking about, not directly taking money from the private sector, but indirectly taking money from the private sector, like philanthropic organization that has been funded by the private sector. That is what we are missing in Africa, and we need it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bitrina. And let me let Ana Maria in.
Enrique, I was just going to come back on something that Bitrina was saying, which
yes, of course,
which I think is a lesson that we've certainly learned as well over the long term, which is a lot of these relationships with the private sector we found have been built on shared frustration. You know, a shared frustration with usually policymakers not doing the right thing or not understanding the policy that they're developing. So I think it's worth kind of just reflecting on that as well, that there's usually something that you're both, you know, really annoyed about. And that's usually the thing that allows you to work closely together. And for us, it was this irritation that policymakers weren't thinking long-term around infrastructure development. And that had a knock-on effect in a variety of different ways. And can we work together to figure out how to make that better? So just building on what Bitrina was saying there around that kind of shared frustration sometimes is a really useful place of working together.
Thank you. And I've invited Ana Maria Sanchez from Mexico, and she works for an organization, CEMEFI, that deals with the private sector quite a bit. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about your organization, and any commentary, response to this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's been a really fascinating conversation, and it's quite needed. I really find it that way because we're okay. So let me tell you a little bit about CEMEFI, which is the name of the organization I work in. So we work with 1,600 members, which from those maybe I don't know, with 2,000 enterprises from different size, shapes, and forms, are all around Mexico. And we're basically working with them for the social corporate responsibility. So that's why we work with these companies to promote social corporate responsibility. And what I found fascinating is and I'm just gonna sort of remark some ideas. I mean, private sector engage in policy. They do engage in policy, and they are really interesting and fascinating, at least in the Mexican concept, to sort of promote democratic processes sometimes. And they are also really keen on following sort of the policies that they affect to them. What I found really hard to sort of do is matching the think tanks interests with the private sector, because most of the times the question for the private sector is what is it in for me? And depending also, and I think it's a question that is something that everybody's raising here. It's what is the value that you bring to me? Can I benefit from the data that you produce? And I think, yeah, there's some and I've seen that. I think private companies, they are consumers of data, and sometimes we have to find what is the data that they should be consuming, and what is the data that they are interested in for, and there is more and more sort of relationship between think tanks and private sectors in Mexico. And especially for, I would say, for the small enterprises and the middle enterprises, the bigger companies, they sort of have the analytical departments, so they produce their own data. So sometimes it's kind of hard just to get into that sector. And I also think, because I've been hearing that quite a lot, it's we should stop thinking of private sector as only funders. What else could we engage with the private sector for? Should they also be partners on the policy making process and in the influencing policy? And my answer to that question, I would say yes. We should put them in together. I mean, we should bring the private sector into the table as well. Be careful. I agree with Jay. I mean, we should really look at the conflict of interest in this regard. That's something. And and I also find it interesting that we should look for the industry chambers to get them involved. So they basically work as sort of big organizations with a lot of members in it. And I would also say the same as I say for the public sector. The private sector, they are not a monolithic sector. So they are gatekeepers, but are also people who might let you in. And that's it. I'm just going to stop here. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
No, thank you, Ana Maria. Thank you very much. And we've had David as well, who joined. David from the Institute for Government. Hi. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for what's been a really fascinating discussion. It's really interesting to get perspectives from around the world, and actually just the extent to which many of the challenges and opportunities appear to be the same. So so I'm tuning in from the Institute for Government in London, and we are a non-aligned think tank that exists to make government more effective. So the way that we try and capture it is we say we focus on the how of government rather than the what. So unlike other usually politically aligned think tanks, we're less interested in a particular piece of policy or shaping a piece of policy that a given government might be looking to launch. At the point that they have launched that policy or are planning to, our job is to make sure that they do so in the most effective way possible. So the majority of our funding comes from private sector partnerships. alongside that, there is a big pot of core funding. So that brings with it, obviously, an awful lot of benefits. And actually, to Chris's point, there's a bit of feedback, I think. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah.
Sorry, David, I will hear you, but Bitrina, just in case, do you mind muting yourself so that we avoid any possible feedback? But yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh yeah, that might be it. Yeah, I think I'm still getting feedback.
Yes, if you could mute yourself, Bitrina.
There we go. I've done it. That's fine. So yes. So the institute benefits from a big pot of core funding from a trust, which obviously means that we have a lot of freedom in being selective. And I say that because it's an important factor. It means that we can be a lot more selective in the partners that we work with. So I just want to share a bit about the sorts of partnerships and also how we've gone about trying to formalize what our offer is. The different types of partners that we work with, and the different sort of challenges involved, but as well as the sort of benefits that private sector partnerships bring to us. So I guess the two main types of partnerships would be, fundraising partnerships. And Anna Maria, it was really interesting to hear your point about, trying to move away from just viewing partners as just a source of funding, but actually what else can they bring to the table beyond that? And also how to navigate those risks, and then secondly also in-kind partnerships, so non-financial ones, often much more straightforward, where there is quite a clear mutual interest and mutual benefit to working together. So many of the sort of benefits and the things that one offers across those two types of partnerships are similar, but there are some kind of key differences, and needless to say, the risks of kind of conflicts of interest and increased need for due diligence, those are higher when dealing with private sector partners where there is funding involved for obvious reasons. So, in kind partnerships, we tend to work with organizations that can provide, whether it's facilities or specific expertise, so it could be data sets, it could be sectoral expertise that we don't have as a think tank, whether it's data sources, kind of sector knowledge. It could be promotion, which helps us to market our recommendations or our research to new audiences. For example, we have a partnership with a membership network for universities, so it means that we can help academics that are looking to influence policymakers with our research, and we can market our learning and development offer to them as well. In some cases, it might be access to high-profile speakers. And so on, or for example, opening us up to new geographies. So around England, we've been doing a project on local government, and we found it very useful to enter in kind partnerships with chambers of commerce or universities in the area that can then give us access to high-profile people across the local government there. The private sector partnerships usually tend to be with vested interests. So these will be, a combination of private sector organizations. It could be big corporations, energy companies. It could be consultancies very often, the likes of the big four. It could be law firms. And generally, they're looking for mainly sort of two things. One is, influence and access to decision makers to help influence a policy outcome. To help lobby, politicians relating to legislation and other issues, and the second objective often is, working with is selling to government, basically. So organisations that are looking to do business with government, and those two different types come with different challenges, as you might expect, and require some really clearly defined rules of engagement. So the obvious benefit to the institute there is external funding, but actually. There are other benefits as well. So I mentioned the expertise. We did a project on government procurement, for example, and we partnered with a law firm that offered financial support, but actually having some lawyers that work on government procurement pore over your research and comment on it is very helpful. And the extent to which they will have a vested interest beyond wanting procurement to function better for government when government is their client is pretty obvious. So that's a bit more clearly defined. On the other hand, we did we had a conference on net zero a while ago, and a big oil company came immediately and wanted to sponsor the whole thing. particularly sessions around energy transition. So there you have to be really careful, because at that point the reputational risk is very large. Your core audience is going to start thinking that perhaps your independence is potentially compromised for obvious reasons. Other benefits, situating your research recommendations in a real world context as well. As think tanks, often you feel like you're shouting recommendations into the void, or you're approaching your core audiences, but actually they're working with a private sector organization. And I think we've seen it a lot, particularly with the sort of energy transition and infrastructure focus of the panelists today. I think where you're actually making things, that's it's a really good real life example there in terms of how your recommendations actually apply to real life, and you can see that route to impact there. For us as well, with private sector organizations, particularly where organizations are looking to influence policymakers and politicians, is that we can educate the lobbyists. So if a lobbyist is going out and trying to influence a politician using our materials, then actually that helps us. That's another route to impact for us. And it's worth saying that different types of partners do bring their own challenges, and it can be tricky to find alignment. So we find that particularly big corporates can often treat you like a consultancy. They expect to be able to commission work from you, and basically we want a report that says this. So you have to sort of be able to push back, and if you're in a position where you can't say no to the money, then of course you have to find a clever way and have some clearly defined rules of engagement, and actually make the case that this is your job, and you're a specialist in this area. And so doing things your way is likely to lead to a much better outcome for them, and something that looks a lot less like whitewashing. And it's worth saying we have an awful lot of despotic regimes and foreign governments with questionable human rights records that often get in touch and want to support our research. So whitewashing can be a real issue as well. Some want to use you, as a route to realizing commercial objectives, as I mentioned. So they might compromise your reputation, for example, by being very commercial if you're offering for them to make opening remarks at an event, or invite them to a private round table with officials or decision makers. So it's also about kind of educating those partners about how to navigate this space. And I think that's another benefit that we can offer as think tanks, is actually showing them how to navigate in a way that doesn't then compromise your work, or provides undue access. And we find, for example, big American tech companies are very data hungry. So if they support a piece of work, they instantly want to harvest every possible bit of data they can. And explaining sort of how European data protection regulation works is a challenge in itself, but also immediately, if they start mining all your valuable data, you might find that your reputation will be compromised there as well. So just to sort of round off, sorry, Kike, we're going to come.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask you a follow-up question for that. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I was just going to quickly run through sort of, our approach, and for us, it's basically having a set of very clear criteria, and they're very basic. So the first is, when assessing a partner, is the area of work and their areas of interest in terms of alignment, is it a fit with your current work program? First question. Ideally you want them to support your core work that you're already planning, because every time you're doing a piece of work for money, and I speak to other think tanks that do very well financially, but they have whole teams, and all these teams do is they organize dinners for corporate partners, they organize conferences, and actually, not as much money as they might like is going to the core research. So watch out for that. In some cases, we will consider opportunities that raise funds for non-core work, but usually we'll try and say, okay, this is work that's related to our mission of improving government effectiveness, but not enough of a priority for us to fund from core resources, for example. And then thirdly, there might be work that's not directly related to our core priorities, but does relate to UK government effectiveness more broadly. So, it could be an event on diversity in the civil service, for example. Or where there might be the potential for us to learn for a future piece of research. Another factor is the funder's reputation and brand. So, we try to work with funders that bring more than just money to the table. And we aim to eliminate any possibility of actual or perceived inappropriate influence. So I mentioned obviously working with law firms, and there are set types of organizations that are easier to work with than others. And also tailoring the nature of a partner's involvement and being incredibly transparent about their involvement. So yeah, we publish all of the funding we receive is published in bands, we publish the names, and we make the partner aware of this. So they are signing up to being transparent by working with us first and foremost. And also, of course, we want expertise, but not at the expense of potential conflicts of interest. So we ask some sort of questions, does the funder contribute more than just financial support? So do they link us to an audience that we don't have? Or is there specific expertise? Are there any conflicts of interest between the funder and the specific topic? So I mentioned, having a big oil company funding an event or a conference on energy transition might be especially risky and compromising. Or are there any wider concerns about the funder's reputation that could have negative spillovers for us? Are they trying to use an association as a way to rehabilitate their reputation? And that's where you can get into slightly tricky territory. So, tobacco companies, fine. That's always going to be a no. But for example, you had KPMG, I think, inappropriately influencing electoral outcomes, for example, in India for a time. But actually, arguably, their reputation has been rehabilitated in as far as, for those firms, they can be. And then another example was Oxfam, and there were accusations of sexual misconduct. Again, Oxfam, their mission, we buy into it. So now we would work with Oxfam. There might be a time when we wouldn't. Whereas, tobacco companies and some arms companies and so on, hard nose. And then also relationships to government. So this maybe is more specific to us because they are our core audience. But we have to be very careful about taking money from government because we want to be free to say rude things about them. And again, taking money from government can pose those risks. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, what I was going to say, I was going to comment on, you're giving us a very nice list of criteria that I think connects very nicely with the experiences from Jay, Chris, and also Bitrina. And I'm going to ask you, Laura, to help us close and everybody to a quick closing remark. But you're telling us a story of, we're not going to pretend the private sector is good and altruistic. We're going to engage with them. We're going to partner with them, but we're going to understand everything. We're going to try to get as much information as we can about them, and we're going to work with them on the basis of being aware of why they're working with us, what they want to get out of it, and if it works for us as well, then it'll be a partnership. It'll be a win-win situation. So nobody is going to be surprised by the outcome, neither them nor you. And I think that's an interesting approach. Thank you very much for that. Let me go back to our panelists and ask you for a kind of one or two ideas. One or two pieces of information, facts, tips, reflections that you take with you from this conversation. Why don't we start with Bitrina first, then Jay, Chris, and Laura. Bitrina, maybe one or two ideas, very briefly, because we're running out of time, but that you can help us finish the session with. Sorry, your audio is not working that well. I can't hear you. It's sort of cut for some reason.
I muted Bitrina while I was speaking to reduce feedback, so she might need to unmute.
No, she's unmuted. It's just something wrong with the connection, I think. No, I can't hear you. Let me go to Jay and then Chris and then Laura, and then we'll go back to you at the end. You might have to refresh your screen, Bitrina, to make sure that it works again. Jay.
Yeah, I think the key ideas, one is, of course, I think I like Chris's perspective of joint frustrations. And I think that's where you can find very fertile ground for action. But I can also say this, that I do know that private industry in India is actually very effective at policy change because they know how to navigate that particular ecosystem because they operate in that ecosystem. So it's not like they are better than us. It's just that sometimes I think think tanks have a better way of putting together the evidence and giving that holistic perspective and giving them that type of connect that may not be possible otherwise, and also taking everyone along. I think sometimes individual private entities may be wary of being seen as the forefront of a particular policy change that would affect the entire industry. And I think that's an important aspect that needs to be considered. I think the takeaways, I really like the way David had put down these set of rules. We do have them informally, and we do follow most of what he said. So I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, I guess Jay's kind of covered off the shared frustrations piece. I guess the other thing I'd reinforce was I think David flagged it in terms of just eyes wide open in some of this engagement. So, being very clear when you're talking to private sector about what it is you want, what it is your objectives are, what's the change you want to see in the world, and then having a conversation with them about the same on their side, because you might walk away from the conversation and decide it's not going to work, but you might also realize actually there's a small piece of a small area where we could potentially work together. And I guess the second thing just to reinforce is, the private sector either implementing this and without any need for kind of government intervention, or government will be doing it, kind of setting the rules for the private sector to operate. So where you can pull in evidence from what's working on the ground, it helps to make your story a lot more compelling to policymakers. So it's less a kind of, here's a nice piece of research that a bunch of academics have sat in a room and dreamt up, towards something that's actually here's something that we know will work because it's based on evidence in terms of what's happening on the ground. So those two pieces I think are quite important when it comes to thinking about that interaction with the private sector.
Great, thank you very much. And Laura, and then I'll read out Bitrina's lessons from the chat.
Thank you all. I think I've learned a lot listening to you all. I came in this session thinking that the private sector was the bad guy, thinking that working in a think tank with a focus on vulnerable communities, I was not allowed to work with or to work for the private sector. But I have now, with your different reflection and discussion, changed my mind on how we can work with the private sector, because in African countries, private sector is key to our economical growth. And if we want to make a vulnerable community less vulnerable, then we have to create richness and we have to create jobs, and this cannot be done without private sector. So now I came out of this with a new way of looking at the private sector and how I can engage with them. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Laura. And Bitrina's writing her lessons on the chat. I've got one here. Money from the private sector is key, but not directly from companies, but through neutral philanthropic organizations, ideally. And I think you have a second one, or is that one it? Your audio is just not working, unfortunately. And funding from the private sector must be understood as a form of collaboration on common goals between think tanks and the private sector. The private sector have resources and think tanks have expertise to change things for the good of society. And I think, great. And also I think there's agreement that they can together work for the better good of society. But you've got to do that, the collaboration has to happen, in a complete transparent way, so that everybody knows what they're getting into. And I think that is a very good lesson about partnership. And Jay, you want to have the last word?
Yeah, I think Laura, be careful. You're not working for the private industry. You're working for the people. The private industry is just a means to that particular end. So I think you did mention for, and I would want to caution you that you have to never be seen as a person working for private industry. You're working for the people. The private industry is just a means to ensure that your work for the people is more widespread and it's more effective. That's the only way to frame this.
Great, fantastic. Great, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us. Laura and I are going to go to another session to have an informal discussion about what we've learned today. So anybody who wants to join is welcome. But yeah, great. And until next time when we meet in person, I hope. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris, Jay, Bitrina, David, Maria, Laura, and everybody for your contributions. Thank you.